Thanks very much to Eric for the introduction, and it's great to be back here in New Zealand. I'm glad to see that the buttons have big next, so I'm going to press that and we'll see what happens. And that didn't work. So I was asked to share my perspective on what the market is demanding, and this is from my viewpoint advising North American and UK retailers and food service companies interested in sustainable seafood. I was asked to give my opinion on what in New Zealand does well, what it does badly, and whether there are areas where it might do better. So a quick intro about Sustainable Fisheries Partnership. We are a US-based environmental NGO, but we work internationally. We have about a $6 million annual budget. 80% of that is from foundations, philanthropic foundations, and we have about 60 full-time equivalents in terms of staff working across 15 countries. And as Eric noted, our primary role is to inform retailers and their supply chains and encourage them into improvement projects. And you have a list of some of the partners that we work with in North America, UK, and elsewhere. I do want to make a quick note. We are not usurping the role of government. There's been a fair amount of negative coverage in the last few months about this. Retailers and suppliers have every right to state their preferences. They do it on food safety, they do it on quality, they do it on ethical concerns, and they're doing it on environmental issues. They may engage in the management process if their interests are not adequately represented by their suppliers or producers. They may adopt voluntary measures in their own business. They may ask their suppliers to do that as well, i.e. on gear use or demonstrating compliance. But the managers are deciding what the regulations are. If the results don't deliver what the retailers are looking for or concerned about, then the retailers may not source. But the retailers and suppliers are not managing fisheries. They're not undermining fisheries management science. In fact, I would argue they're contributing to it and strengthening it. I do want to take a step back for a second. It's great to be here in New Zealand because we've been able to point to New Zealand as a leading example of successful fisheries management and innovation for many years. This is what we said in response to the New York Times article that came out a few years ago on Hoki. And in this story, of course, they mentioned one of our long-term partners, McDonald's. And we noted that this Hoki fishery deserved praise, not condemnation. We sent a message to the critics at the time saying that New Zealand has good science, good management, and it should be on the cutting edge of fisheries management and marine conservation. There's no doubt about that. So it is fair for critics to press for further improvements beyond those required by global standards such as the MSC. But they should not do so by asserting the fishery is unsustainable or poorly managed or that the MSC is fraudulent somehow. To do so is unfair. To do so is dishonest. And we would argue that critics should argue the fishery is good but could be even better. So we said that publicly a few years ago, immediately after the New York Times article came out. We also highlighted what we see as innovations and best practices that New Zealand sets the pace. And I've particularly been a fan of the benthic protected area network. It is not unconditional love. I think there were some mistakes made. But nonetheless, as new areas are identified as important, we said, the debate over further protection needs should be less controversial. This is due to the acknowledged existence of similar areas already under protection, a pre-existing agreement between opposing stakeholders over a clear set of ecosystem management objectives, an established framework for using scientific information. These were all innovations here in New Zealand, the first time they'd been used in setting up a representative network. The process was not perfect. We did note that. There is controversy. I'm well aware of what some NGOs here view the process. I think they have a case in some areas, but not in others. But nonetheless, the stage is set for diverse stakeholders to work together cooperatively to find long-term solutions. That stage exists here due to the innovation by the industry. It does not exist in other countries at this point in time. So New Zealand is out in front on some key issues. We also review, as a matter of course, all of the major fisheries in each of the major sectors that our buyers, partners are concerned about. And each year we put out a sector overview, one on whitefish. We've got one coming out on tuna shortly. We've done one on small pelagics. And in the whitefish one that came out at the beginning of this year, we noted something that I believe to be true. If it's not true, I'll find out later. But at the end of your last MSC certification, my understanding was that the fishery had closed out all of its conditions, which was a remarkable achievement, and yet New Zealand was radio silent on this because you had a new certification which brought in some new conditions. But we did flag this up. This briefing is given to your major customers. They all knew that this had happened, and we flagged that up and said that, you know, two fisheries in particular, the Hoki fishery, had fulfilled all the MSC conditions that they had at that time, at the end of 2012. And obviously the Hoki fisheries feature very high up on the table of whitefish fisheries worldwide. So, you know, that's what we've said about New Zealand. We pride ourselves on being science-based, evidence-based, trying to get a good balanced picture of what's going on. Our position as an advisor to these major buyers depends on their confidence in our balanced view and that we give solid advice that reflects all the different angles that they need to consider and that we have their best interests at heart. We partner with our partners for the long term. It's not a short term, let's win this one debate. We know that we have 20 or 30 years ahead of us working in fisheries in developing countries, and that's the focus to maintain these partnerships for the long term. So coming back to what New Zealand does well, as already noted, no doubt, good stock assessments, good tax setting, good catch compliance, good consultation. I had one of the most boring days of my life, courtesy of George Clement, who invited me to a stock assessment meeting in Wellington a few years ago, and I thought, thank God I never became a scientist. It was deadly. But there's me, having just got off the airplane, walking into a stock assessment meeting with your leading scientists, welcomed, everything's transparent, it's all on the table. I can tell you that is not the experience I had in Moscow. So you have some very good innovations in ecosystem-based fisheries management. What New Zealand does badly, and not really much, and certainly not much really badly from a global perspective, but I do think there have been some missteps. There have been some obvious examples of failures in compliance, which have already been noted. Some loopholes in regulations have been exploited. There has been historical overconfidence in voluntary codes versus regulation. And there has been the exclusion of some stakeholders from some consultations, particularly in the early stages. I think that last point is very interesting because it's the one I'm going to come back to, is how to build consensus with your critics. And it's a very difficult job to build consensus, for example, like has happened on the benthic protected area networks. And it may have been that there was no alternative to the way it was done. I understand that. It was difficult enough to bring the industry along with the government, never minding having some of the NGOs in the room. I understand that, and I accept that that may be the case, but it did have consequences, and we're still working through those now. So let's do a deeper dive into what retailers want and how the NGOs, media, regulators, catchers, and retailers interact. So what do retailers really want? The usual suspects: assured supply, quality, price. Retailers choice edit. Every retailer does this. Some may not put an MSC label on the pack, but they're using that information in order to determine whether they should stock your product, even if they don't use the logo. So they only put on the shelves products that they are comfortable marketing to their customers. That doesn't mean that they will not, that does not mean they will only buy from the best. Nor does it mean that fisheries need to agree with everything NGOs ask. I'm just going to repeat that. Doesn't mean they won't buy from anyone but the best, and it certainly doesn't mean they expect their suppliers to go along with what every NGO asks for. Brands will source from improving fisheries if they can point to clear evidence that the source is improving. They will continue to source even from fisheries that have significant problems well beyond those here in New Zealand, especially if they can demonstrate that it's the work of their suppliers that is making those improvements happen. Because that is then a case that they can say, look, we're having a positive impact. It's our continued sourcing that is driving that improvement in these fisheries, and therefore we're going to stay in it. And that's a very powerful and compelling message, and that's something we've really worked with our partners to make sure they communicate to their critics. But brands want no surprises. That would be the most important thing. The CEO does not want to wake up in the morning to Hugh's Fish Fight on Channel 4 in the UK saying that Tesco is cheating on their fad caught tuna. He doesn't want that. That results in a knee-jerk reaction and bad decisions. No controversy or media stories that may damage their brand, and ideally some nice stories about progress or performance that they can use to market their fish. So they really, as usual, your customers want everything. Cheap fish, high quality, cheaper fish, even cheaper again. And by the way, they want a nice story and no environmental issues about it. So it's all very high demand. They want fisheries to commit to continuous improvement, even if the performance is already very good. The world's best brands do not turn around to their customers and say, we're done, we're good enough. Find me a brand that says that. Every major brand says we are committed to continuous improvement. They know they have to be. The world is not standing still. They want fisheries to get the fisheries and ecosystem management right. They definitely want credible third-party verification. They want clear demonstration of progress. They would love their suppliers and their sources to be leading the process of improvement, not being dragged kicking and screaming through public media campaigns. And they would certainly want people to manage the public debate and perceptions around the fishery. If an issue gets into the press that mentions one of our partners, someone messed up somewhere. If it mentions it in a negative light, that's an error, somewhere in the supply chain, somewhere on our path. What do they expect from their individual suppliers? The job is getting harder and harder. It's no longer just meeting minimum legal requirements. It's about meeting environmental, social, ethical supplier codes. That is so 90s, as my young nieces will tell me whenever I talk to them about what's cool and what's not. Be informed. They expect their suppliers to be informed of these requirements, not hearing about it from their customers. They would want you to anticipate what their needs will be and find ways to exceed them. They want you to work together with customers and peers to spread these best practices globally. They certainly expect their suppliers to work collaboratively with their competitors to influence the development of an entire fishery and seafood sector. And they really want their suppliers to effectively cover their interests and concerns as well as those of the supply chain. That's a key point, that these retailers and their first-tier suppliers are looking further down the supply chain and saying, if you represent my interests, that would be really very helpful. And they are definitely looking to suppliers to manage and lead debate with critics to avoid negative media. Just a quick side story, in 2006, Greenpeace smeared one of the suppliers we work with in Europe. They got them cold to rights buying illegal fish. And the CEO of that company refused to have anything to do with Greenpeace because he felt that they had been, if you will, cheated into the purchase. I said, regardless of the case, you have to talk. You have to have a negotiation. You have to protect the brands of the customers you're selling to. And he was able to do that. He got past this, I won't talk to them, they're thugs. And he was able to get his name and that of his customers removed from the negative media within 36 hours. And that was noted by his customers, and he won more business as a result. So keep in mind, New Zealand is doing very well. These are offered as sort of my opinion, and I'm doing so humbly because I know a lot of people in this room have really tried to do these things already, and it's not easy. But I think it would be great for New Zealand to make a very formal commitment on continuous improvement. You're already doing it. How about setting some measurable public targets and milestones looking out 2, 5, 10 years for some of those measures? As noted earlier, I don't think there's that much more to be done on the target stocks. I think you're also developing good science tools and methods for ecosystem-based fisheries management. I'll talk about some leadership opportunities on that in a second. Third-party verification. You are already using MSC. That is the best available. Nothing further to add on that one. Demonstrate progress. As I mentioned before, report against agreed public targets and milestones for improvement. The MSC does provide that through its annual audits, but those only go up to a certain level, which is the sort of 80 level, if you will, the no conditions passing level or global average best practices required by the MSC. New Zealand is a lucky country. It's got a great governance capacity. It has a great resource, great science. It has a rich people by global standards. They're very environmentally aware. They're going to hold you to a higher standard than a global average best practices. That's just the way life is. I think, therefore, New Zealand needs to look at how they measure progress beyond what the MSC will look at. You are already scoring well above the 80 level in many fisheries. And in a few, like New Zealand Hockey, I would expect to see no scores below 80 very shortly. That needs to be communicated, measured, and put forward. A great record on innovation. Obviously, the seabird bycatch reduction methods, well known, the clear targets, as I mentioned before, for representation in benthic protected area networks. I do note that some of this leadership was, however, driven by NGO pressure or the threat or perceived threat of laws coming potentially down the pipe. I do think there is opportunity to lead further in EBFM, ecosystem-based fisheries management. No one sets target levels for endangered species. You set minimum impact levels, but you don't say how many sea lions do you want alive in the water 10, 20 years from now? What are you managing for? As far as I'm aware, that doesn't exist even now. And of course, leading on social, labor, and ethical issues, which are, I think, coming up the list of priorities for our partners very, very quickly. Managing the public debate. Everyone loves a good bun fight, myself included. Your customers don't. If an NGO requests for improvements are ignored, what do? They raise public concern to put pressure on the ministers. To do this, they need media coverage. Your NGO critics are smart people, they're not evil, but they need to get media coverage. How do you sell newspapers? You dumb something down, you give it a negative spin. It's not the journalist's fault, it's not the environmental NGO's fault. That's what sells newspapers. Everywhere around the world, it's the same. So they're going to take a complicated issue with a lot of ups and downs, and they're just going to smear it and paint it all as bad news, because they have to get some coverage, because they've been ignored or feel they have. So on one side, we have extreme statements from the greenies, and then reactionaries on the industry side go, well, that's not fair, that's not accurate, and it's not, so they react. One or both parties might even sue the government. Industry lobbyists and PR companies love it, justifies their existence, they jump in, they turn the heat up further. Media loves it, great, even more newspapers are being sold. Wow, it'd be even better if we could drag a whole household brand into this. If we could find a customer that everybody knows, then we'll get even more awareness amongst the public. And that end result is what customers don't want. That is New Zealand Hockey in the New York Times mentioning explicitly McDonald's. The opening line of the article said filet of fish. It's the slave labor story and a variety of brands that were impacted by that. The Orange Roughy story and a variety of brands. What they do want, it is doable. This is a comment from Greenpeace back in 2007 after some of the major importers of whitefish from Russia into Europe got together to figure out how to verify the legality of their supplies. And it had a very quick impact in Russia. They had to raise their game and figure out how to improve compliance in their catch sector. Greenpeace had asked for something absolutely impossible. The industry said, we can't do that, you'll drive us out of business, but we understand there's an IUU problem, let us figure out a solution that will work for us. So Greenpeace was very distrustful of this. They thought we're just being snowed. And I said, give them a chance, there's something here. A few months later, this huge announcement was made by the biggest importers. They were able to put in place control documents with their supply chain. And at the end of the day, even Greenpeace was willing to admit that this had made a big impact and provide congratulations. At this point, there's no doubt in a customer's mind that something good has happened if their biggest critic is now applauding what's happened. And this was something the industry chose to do. They were under pressure, but they found a solution that worked for them. How not to respond. Do not try and rescue the global image of fisheries. There are really bad fisheries around the world in developing countries. They're not going away. They're not going to get fixed in 20 years. You cannot tell your customers fisheries are fine. It's not going to happen. Insinuation media, regardless of how good you are, this was a cover of Harper's Magazine in the United States. It's one of the most popular sort of thought leader magazines on environmental issues, amongst other things. They did one narrow story on how bad an artisanal fishery is in the Gulf of California, and from that they extrapolated to the dismal future of the global fishery. Like I said, they need to sell, they're going to draw attention. Instead of saying one little bit of Mexico's in a bit of trouble, now it's the global fisheries. We're not as carbon intensive as beef. Well, that's true, but some of your biggest customers sell beef. They don't want you to point that out. I call it the we're not as crap as them strategy. It's not very compelling. Denying there's a problem or arguing the requirements are too high. Another version of the we're not as crap as the other guy's strategy. May be true, but it's not useful. It does not fully address the customer's concerns and their brand reputation requirements. Refusing to negotiate, attacking critics, or stirring up controversy. Greenpeace are just in it for the money. This is a popular refrain, particularly in the United States at the moment. It is just rubbish. It's demonstrably not true, and your customers are not going to thank you for making the claim, because Greenpeace will be like, great, this is more media coverage. Let's bring these companies back into the frame. They don't want you to attack the critics in a way that will raise the pressure. So is this mission impossible? Well, maybe. You're certainly going to need the patience of a saint. You will need political skills, possibly as good as Bill Clinton. You will need to be very peaceful in how you venture forth your public opinions, even if you want to clobber the guys who are criticizing you. That's perfectly natural. I feel like that every time someone prints something untrue about SFP or what we're doing. And you do need to be a mind reader. You need to figure out what the hell the other guys actually really want. Why are they making these outrageous claims? They know that's not going to happen. Why are they doing it? There's a reason behind these things. Dig in, have a conversation, find out. I do think reaching out and consulting with all stakeholders is critical. It can be one-on-one to start with, identify areas of concern and actual objectives, not what's stated in a public campaign. Remember, that's been dumbed down for public consumption. These guys want something, they want something specific, you need to figure out what it is, and then figure out a way to give it to them, or at least find out a place to negotiate, find a trade-off, find a compromise that'll work. They're realists. These guys know, they've been around the block. One thing I do advise the partners I work with is when you are negotiating with an activist NGO that's hanging off your building, don't talk to the guy hanging off the building. Talk to his boss. Make sure he's been there for 10 years, he's over 35, he's lost a whole bunch of battles, he would love to win something. This guy is, find the right people to negotiate with. Review the science and the feasibility of alternative solutions, identify those negotiation options. You have to fairly and honestly describe in full all the criticism. I think this happens so rarely because people go on the defensive, but I did highlight this this thing that I found in the recent Squid advice paper from MPI. Stakeholders obviously went nuts and said this is dreadful for the sea lion, and MPI said, well, we think much of this reaction is overreaction, it's a poor understanding of the science and the facts, but we understand there's some uncertainty associated with the science. We will recommend a more cautious approach. And then they said, let's address that criticism transparently and substantively. And they said we'll have an independent review of the models that have been used to check on what's the impact at the population level. Not the detail, but getting into the big picture of what are the trends at the population level. And independent, high-quality science like that has been critical in similar situations. Very emotive sea mammal interactions with fisheries. Stellar sea lion declines in Alaska plagued the U.S. industry 2002, 3, 4, 5. They did a number of studies, and a very impressive scientist, Mark Mangle, did a lot of amazing modeling. And at the end of the day, people understood there was a lot more to it than first met the eye. There were other reasons for these declines, and you had a much more substantive debate. But again, it involved a scientist that other groups trusted leading the debate in a very public way. So it doesn't mean giving in, but this open, transparent, I call it science, evidence/based consultation approach, it clarifies the issues, demonstrates the complaints have been heard and taken seriously, and that's a key first starting point. Hopefully, by doing this, you end up with smarter solutions that satisfy multiple stakeholders. You may not satisfy everyone. That's too much to ask. You don't need to, but you do need to identify a group that will collaborate and on these cooperative solutions. And I hope, and what we've seen in multiple fisheries around the world, is when you do this, you can take the heat out of the debate. An activist NGO that feels that its concerns are being adequately addressed will not go to the media. They have 10 other things to do that day. If they're getting somewhere with you, they'll go somewhere else. We've seen that happen time and time again. Once the heat's out of the debate, it's not in the public media, then you can have a sensible, nuanced, detailed conversation. Of course, that does assume that the stakeholders involved genuinely interested in the solutions and don't have anything to hide. And I think that kind of very formal consultation and reporting of what the different stakeholders have said, and doing so in an open and transparent way, really could be formally regularized and adopted here. You're already doing so much of it. I do think the same thing needs to happen on social issues. Just to clarify with SFP's position, we are not here to block imported labor from fishing jobs. That would shut down a lot of fisheries that I think are working out fine, but we do want to ensure that workers' rights are protected throughout the process, from getting recruited to working on the boats. So, conclusion, and this is kind of how I feel about New Zealand. I used to play rugby before I got hospitalized too many times. I never played New Zealand, and I'm very thankful for that. I don't think I would have got out of the hospital. So I think you guys play hard to win. There's no doubt about that. But I also think you're known for playing fair by the rules. But that doesn't mean, you're going to get kicked around. You have to play to your strengths. And I thought this quote, I do remember watching the Underwood brothers getting smacked all over the pitch back in 1995. And it's within the rules, play to your strengths. Remember, all 14 of you passed the ball to Jonah. So on that point, thank you very much.